Good afternoon and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another jam-packed episode, just as we have every single week. And please, if you want to see any of our archives, we are on YouTube, youtube.com/North Star Oasis. Now, for those of you who have watched our show for a period of time, hopefully a year, you'll know that we have one official holiday of North Star Oasis. And even though Christmas, there's 329 shopping days left until Christmas, that's actually not our official holiday. That's just a day off. I mean, granted, it's an official holiday, but for the purposes of our show, Groundhog Day is our official holiday, and we are going to be observing our second anniversary of the North Star Oasis Groundhog Day holiday coming up on Tuesday. But I was going to talk more about Groundhog Day, but I realized I did that last year. So go to youtube.com/North Star Oasis and go back to February of 2015, and you will see our Groundhog Day episode. And that way you can understand the history of Groundhog Day and why we celebrate a rascally little rodent that tells us about the weather. And I'm not talking about the Bill Murray movie, but North Star Oasis on YouTube, look for our Groundhog Day video because Groundhog Day is coming up on Tuesday. And one of the reasons why we decided to get away from Groundhog Day on this show is because of another momentous event that occurred. And this time was 30 years ago, and I was a ninth grader in fifth hour study hall when the following was viewed across the television set as school children across the country were watching. Let's take a look at the video.
Seconds, and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds.
Yeah.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Looks like a couple of the solid rocket boosters blew away from the side of the shuttle in an explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
And that was 30 years ago. January, this past Thursday, would have marked the 30th anniversary of what you just saw. That was the Space Shuttle Challenger that had exploded over the Atlantic Ocean after launch at Cape Canaveral on January 28th, 1986, killing Dick Scobie, Mike Smith, Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, Ron McNair, and Krista McAuliffe, who was the first teacher in space. And with us right now for the rest of today's show is Mitch Berg from AM 1280 The Patriot. He has a show, the Northern Alliance Radio, and that's on from Saturdays 1 to 3. And then you're also a blogger on shotinthedark.info. And Mitch, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So what do you remember about that particular day? What were you doing?
I had been working at KSTP AM, which at the time was a talk radio station. I'd been there about a month, my first real job out of college that wasn't working construction in North Dakota. And I was in the control room, and we were covering it live, because of course it was a big deal, the first non-astronaut, the first civilian in space, basically, the first non-NASA astronaut in space, Krista McAuliffe. And we were covering it live, and the word that the shuttle had blown up came down the line, and we were covering it live as it happened, and everyone was sort of aghast, and basically the whole staff of the station piled into the control room at the same time. And I was the lowliest employee in the place at the time. But I was in the position of, when you're in radio, especially a major station, when you're in the control room, you are in absolute control, and you tell everyone from the general manager to the news director to the legendary John McDougall to Kathy Werzer to shut up and let you concentrate on doing what you're supposed to be doing. And it was interesting, a heady experience, and certainly a great, interesting time to be working in live radio. So that was what I was doing that day.
And then also, this week is not just on the Challenger, but there also Apollo 1 fire, which killed 3 astronauts. That was January 27th of 1967. And then you also had, on February 1st of 2003, you had the breakup of the Space Shuttle Columbia. I actually, when I was in the Air Force, I was actually at the memorial service at the National Cathedral, representing my unit at that particular observance. So, the whole space program, a little real to me, having those connections. What do you remember about the Columbia?
Well, the thing I remember about the Columbia was thinking, well, of course it broke up. I mean, the magic blew away with the Challenger. I mean, it seems like it was longer, obviously. I mean, I was just a little too young to remember Apollo 1, although I do remember Apollo 8 orbiting the moon. And I remember watching the TV when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. So I do have some fairly significant memories of the space program at that age. And we had a great run there for 20 years, almost no problems, I mean, close calls, certainly. I do remember Apollo 13 as well, the one that we almost didn't get back.
That's right.
But after Challenger blew up, it was sort of like, okay, this is just another government program with a bunch of more equipment built by the lowest bidder. And I had this kind of feeling like, well, that had to happen sometime, didn't it?
And, with the Challenger, I actually pulled a quote here. This is a recently discovered quote from John Glenn. He was then a U.S. Senator, but before then, of course, he was an astronaut. And John Glenn was actually at Cape Canaveral on that day when the Challenger exploded, and he and then Vice President George H.W. Bush had both addressed the staff at the Mission Control. And the one thing that Glenn had stated, and this was caught on video, and the National Geographic Channel just ran a special called The Challenger, The Lost Tapes. That this tape of what was going on in launch control was missing for the last 3 decades, and it was only recently discovered. And from that tape, John Glenn had said, really, if we're honest about it and honest with ourselves, beyond our wildest dreams, I would have never thought we would ever go this far without losing some people. We come to a time when something happens and we have a tragedy that goes along with our triumphs, and I guess that's the story of all mankind.
Yeah, and I remember that quote when John Glenn made the quote. I was thinking, when you compare every other wave of exploration humanity's ever done, whether it was Polynesians sailing balsa wood rafts across the South Pacific. You got to figure they didn't all make it to the shores of Ecuador or Polynesia. I forget which way they went. I've seen Thor Heyerdahl's movie several times, or read the book a few times. I keep forgetting. Did they go west to east or east to west?
With Magellan, they went from Spain over to Brazil.
Yeah, but that was easy. I'm talking about the Polynesians on those rafts that floated across.
I don't
with
remember
not a whole lot of directional control.
But even look at Magellan. I mean, it went around to the Straits of Magellan,
right.
Called now.
Who could have seen that coming?
Yeah, no kidding. And then ended up dying a gruesome death in the Philippines.
That's right.
And I think I had just recently written a story about this a couple of weeks ago, and I believe it was only 18 of the original crew survived and made it back to Spain.
That's right. Well, you think about some of the other scientific achievements that involve some kind of risk. I mean, breaking the sound barrier. We all remember The Right Stuff and how many pilots died trying to get a plane to go past the sound barrier.
That was my favorite movie, by the way.
That was right up there.
All time.
It's right up there. Yeah, it's a great movie. But no, I do remember John Glenn saying that and thinking, yeah, he's got a point here. We've actually gotten by on the cheap, and by gosh, that's the way we like it here in America too. That's the way it should be.
And then Reagan's remarks that night also kind of alluded to Magellan and the exploration.
Right.
And
it was. I had an interesting time that day because, of course, one of the jobs they set me on after I got off the control room was find an astronaut. And my home, there happened to be an astronaut from my hometown who'd been a student of my father's in high school. He was probably about 10, 12, maybe 15 years older than me actually at that point. But he was an astronaut. He did actually wind up flying in space a couple times on the shuttle, at least twice.
Do you remember who that is?
Richard Hieb was his name, H-I-E-B. And it was not a great time. It's one of those times when when anyone with a conscience has got to think, boy, it stinks to be a reporter. But the job is to go out and find I was a producer at the time. The job is to go out and find a quote from an astronaut, and it was the only one I knew, and I happened to know how to get a hold of him, and it was difficult. It was a difficult time to be an astronaut, and you could tell. You could tell it was. You could tell the fact that it had been a fairly easy ride for our space program in terms of casualties up to that point didn't make it any easier that day. So.
That's true. But we are actually going to move on as we remember what happened 30 years ago. But now we talk about difficult times. We're kind of facing difficult times today, but we got 51 more weeks, and then we have a presidential inauguration. And we've got a bunch of candidates that are all lined up, and they've been campaigning hard, both Democrat and Republican. And we, if you regular viewers of this show know that we've been just about every week we do something political, and we try to give some balance here, both sides, equal time. All last year we went through as candidates were first announced on giving them their little bit of moment of glory to let you see more than what the sound bites that the mainstream TV media would give you. And now it's time for closing arguments as we head into Monday's Iowa caucuses. And so we're going to show you little clips. Look at it this way, that what we show you is what the Iowa and New Hampshire voters see across the television set. Outside of the news and outside of a candidate coming to their hometown and addressing them, how do people gauge their opinions? They gauge it from what they see on TV, and these are the ads that are appearing all across Iowa and all across New Hampshire right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at one ad, we'll discuss the candidate, and we'll move on to the other, and that way you can get a little bit of a feel for what Iowans are going through right now. And don't worry, Minnesota, you'll get your chance. We got Minnesota's precinct caucuses coming up on March 1st, and so we got probably about 2 to 3 weeks. We might even start seeing some of these ads coming up ourselves. So we're going to start off with Martin O'Malley.
I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I'm running for President of the United States to bring new leadership forward for our country and to build upon the good work that President Obama and Vice President Biden have done. And in my own state, I had the backbone to take on the NRA, and I'll do it again, to pass comprehensive gun safety legislation. I'm running for president to bring new leadership to our country and build on President Obama's progress. I need you. Thanks a lot.
So, Mitch Berg, Martin O'Malley currently is polling, according to Real Clear Politics, their average of polls, he is polling 4.4%. And that was his closing argument.
That's about 4% better than I figured he'd be doing at this point. It's interesting to see at this point that obviously they're running for the Democrat base and how they're. I would like to think. I see an ad like this and I like to imagine what it would be like if somehow Martin O'Malley did get the nomination against all odds. So it would seem at this point. Perhaps involving a dinosaur swooping out of the heavens and eating Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton.
Well, that could happen.
It's the only path to the White House I see for Martin O'Malley at this point. And the question I have is, okay, he is, in this ad, lighting up the NRA like the 4th of July. That's obviously red meat for their base because that's the way they're wired. I'd be amazed to see how he would back away from that and tack back towards the center on guns, which are absolute poison outside of Maryland for Democrats. It'd be interesting to see. Okay, Mr. O'Malley, I'd love to be in the press box for that for that press conference. So, Mr. O'Malley, you went and basically called the NRA everything but your ex-mother-in-law. So what are you going to do now that you got to take your act somewhere west of the Appalachians? Ain't gonna fly.
How long do you think Martin O'Malley stays in this race?
I think he stays in it in some point or some form or another till the convention. I could very well be wrong, but I mean, I don't know what the downside is from. I will also say, by the way, I don't know who running his social media, but at the end of that spot there, you saw his official hashtag, Committacaucus, COMMITTOCAUCUS. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, and it certainly doesn't roll off the fingers. I think he needs to probably reboot that social media presence for whatever good it'll do him.
We're going to move on to Hillary Clinton. Here's her closing argument.
I have spent my entire adult life looking for ways to even the odds, to help people have a chance to get ahead, to find the ways for each child to live up to his or her God-given potential. I'm fighting for all Americans, not just some, for the struggling, the striving, and the successful. No matter who you are, what you look like, what faith you practice, or who you love, I am fighting for you. I'm fighting for everyone who's ever been knocked down but refused to be knocked out. I'm going to fight until every little girl in America knows she can grow up to be anything she wants, even President of the United States.
Well, right now, Hillary and Bernie Sanders are neck and neck in the polls. Really, there's not, it's just such a razor-thin margin right now. It's going to be the race to watch, I think, come Monday.
Oh, yeah.
Your thoughts about Hillary and her campaign so far and her closing argument?
Speaking as someone who's not a Hillary fan, and by the way, someone who's seeing all these ads for the first time because I haven't actually watched network or cable TV since the last half season of Walking Dead went off the air, which I think I'm not alone among Americans these days. I think what the interesting thing about Hillary's campaign to me so far is it's almost like there's two completely different people out there, and it's the same ad, it's the same candidate, it's the same woman yelling at you from the podium wherever she's at.
You noticed the yelling part.
Oh yeah, it's so shrill, and of course we're told now we can't use the term shrillery to refer to her because that's sexist. So heaven forbid I won't do that. But you ask a Republican who watches that ad, and they'll say, "Wow, it's shrill, and we're being yelled at, and she's playing so very hard to the extreme of the base. I mean, looks like she's almost trying to move to the left of Sanders in a lot of ways." And you ask a Democrat, and some of my Democrat friends are going, "She is firing on all 8 cylinders these days. She is being received 5 by 5, and she is gonna stomp off to the White House unimpeded." It's like Hillary Clinton is a Rorschach blob these days. I emphasize the term Rorschach blob these days, and it's just amazing. I mean, basically, I think everyone in America is projecting what they think about this election onto Hillary Clinton at this point. I personally think terrible campaign, terrible campaigner, but we'll see.
There's been talk, again, it's talk right now about Hillary being indicted. And,
oh, yeah.
We know that there's no love lost between the Clintons and the Obamas.
Right.
The Clintons had the they were the kingmakers of the Democratic Party now for 25 years. And now we get President Obama. He's now been there for 7, soon to be 8 years. And the Obamas don't really want to relinquish the stage back to the Clintons. And there's talk that the Obama administration could indict. Your thoughts about that?
I will believe it when I see it, quite frankly. I mean, yes, from the noises I'm hearing from people who follow things like this, like Hugh Hewitt, of course, my good friend on the Salem Network, Hugh Hewitt, who's a lawyer and follows these sorts of things for part of his living, is convinced that Hillary is going to get indicted at some point here. I am thinking, call me a cynic, call me someone who was an adult during the Clinton administration and a conservative and a Republican. But I look at the Clinton legacy and the stranglehold that the Clintons have, both of them still, on the mainstream media, the opinion makers, on Hollywood, on an awful lot of very powerful people who, let's be honest, haven't sounded off yet. I think once we get past this first round of primaries, you're going to see a push not only in terms of public relations, advertising, and public opinion, but in the back channels that really do have a disproportionate amount of control over our legal system. And I think, call me excessively cynical. Feel free.
Excessively cynical.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Mitch.
Nothing I don't call myself at times. But I just have this feeling that there's going to be some way that any talk of indictments gets gun-decked until after the election, and then poof, it's gone.
I can see that. On the other hand, I could also see that if Hillary does not get the nomination, that the Obamas could come out and indict sometime down the road, but before the election.
Yeah.
That we'll find that out as time goes on, I guess.
It could be, but there's an awful lot of very powerful people in Hollywood and in finance and a lot of liberal plutocrats with deep pockets who have a fairly vested interest in making sure that Obama doesn't take down the Democratic Party out of a 8-year-old grudge against Hillary Clinton.
Well, speaking of Bernie Sanders here, and speaking of Hollywood, since you're watching these ads for the first time, I have to actually say that I am really impressed with this next ad.
Oh, really?
Bernie Sanders. There's just something about the way they've produced this ad that I thought was really awe-inspiring. And let's take a look at Bernie Sanders' ad.
Let us be lovers, we'll marry our fortunes together. I've got some real estate here in my bag. Counting the cars on the New Jersey Turnpike, they've all come to look for America. All come to look for America.
I'm Bernie Sanders, and I approve this message.
Well, there's really no substance there, but there's a feel. What do you think of that ad and getting the feeling of excitement for Bernie Sanders? Is that effective?
Of course it's effective. It's a brilliant ad in a lot of ways. I mean, for starters, it's by far, like, Head, Shoulders, and Ankles, my favorite Simon and Garfunkel song. So if you want to reel me in, that'll do it. But as you pointed out, there is no substance there. And there's a piece that came out this week in National Review by Kevin Williamson, who's, by the way, my favorite libertarian conservative writer going these days, up there with Charles C.W. Cook. And he wrote a piece of it's an attack, not an attack, but it's a critique of Donald Trump's campaign and how it's really the triumph, kind of like Obama was 7 years ago, the triumph of illiteracy over literacy in politics. I mean, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and let's be honest, Ron Paul, in a lot of ways, basically substituted a lot of easy-to-repeat chanting points, easy-to-memorize images, little bromides that stick in the listeners' and the voters' craw. I shouldn't say craw, in the ear and stick in the head.
Back of the mind.
Basically political earworms.
Now, when you take a look, though,
this is one of them.
But look at the shrill voice of Hillary in that previous ad.
Oh, yeah.
Do you even remember who Martin O'Malley is in his ad?
Yeah, he's the governor of some state out east. No, you're exactly right. I mean,
and then you take a look at this, where you got the catchy Simon and Garfunkel tune.
Yeah. And
you got some energy and excitement there,
and not one instance of Bernie Sanders' voice anywhere in the spot,
except the very end.
Yeah, okay. There's that. Of course, you got to have
the
that.
disclaimer.
But yeah, very little. Yeah, there's something to that, I think, and it's a memorable image. Absolutely no substance. Absolutely no look ahead to 4 or 8 years of Sanders's time in office and seeing the bill that our grandchildren are going to be paying. But
Now,
that's not
considering that Bernie Sanders is a self-proclaimed Democrat socialist, and when we see the last 7 years of the Obama administration, how people are questioning whether the president actually has America's best interest in mind, and then you see this ad where you're seeing the American flag put up by a Democrat, when you're seeing crowds of people and you're seeing the word America appearing on TV. Is that a chance at just kind of showing what Bernie may not be, or that he really genuinely does care about America?
I think it's pure marketing. I mean, I think it's Bernie Sanders trying to brand himself as the socialist who cares deeply about the big A word, America, and it's aimed at reaching into the hearts of a lot of people who may not necessarily be Democrats. I mean, that's the thing about Sanders. Him and Trump are both coloring way outside of the traditional party box to find their voters, and it's almost the photo negative. I should say an attempt to be the photo negative almost of Ronald Reagan's Morning in America. I mean, trying to reach out to people who are not necessarily predisposed to his party to start off with, but trying to reel them in anyway, and using simple, powerful images and not a whole lot of substance, as you pointed out. Yeah, I think that's what he's doing. I think he's just doing this to reach outside the base, whereas O'Malley is reaching to nothing but the base, and Hillary is trying to convince everyone that they are the base.
So then, before we switch over to the Republican side, one last question.
Okay.
Your prediction for what happens on the Democrat side on Monday in the Iowa caucuses.
I predict, boy, that's a tough one. I think Hillary pulls it off. I think it's going to be ugly, and I think it's going to be expensive. I think it's going to be the beginning of a few months of trench warfare for the Democrats. At least I hope so.
All right. And we're going to move on here to the Republican side. And for the candidate who actually has already admitted that the end may be near, we're going to take a look at the closing argument for Rick Santorum, who won the Iowa caucuses 4 years ago.
Like green eggs and ham.
Ted Cruz is wonderful at reading children's fairy tales on the Senate floor.
Sam, I am.
Rick Santorum spent his time in the Senate a little differently. 8 years on the Senate Armed Services Committee, helping to modernize today's Army to better be prepared for today's threats. Santorum also wrote and passed tough laws, putting harsh sanctions on Iran. And for more than a decade, Rick Santorum has been a leader taking on radical Islam.
Not all Muslims are jihadists, and no one would say that. But the reality is, all jihadists are Muslims.
You want someone to read one hell of a bedtime story? Ted Cruz is your guy. If you want to protect America and defeat ISIS, Rick Santorum's your president, because serious times need serious people.
I'm Rick Santorum, and I approve this message.
So, according to the Real Clear Politics average of polls, Rick Santorum, 1.2%. And this is coming from the person who won the Iowa caucuses 4 years ago. He has admitted this past week that the end may be near for him. And I did hear one thing that he, if he does leave the race, that he will probably back Ted Cruz. Yet he just attacked Ted Cruz in his ad. Your thoughts briefly on Rick Santorum and his decline? Why hasn't he been able to pick up traction?
Well, first of all, you got to remember, 4 years ago, Rick Santorum was the last Republican standing who wasn't Mitt Romney. He was the conservatives' last stand in the caucuses, even by the time we got to the Minnesota caucuses last election, 4 years ago. A lot of us who would normally not have been supporting Rick Santorum caucused for him because he wasn't either Mitt Romney or Ron Paul. So he was the only choice you had. So I even caucused for Santorum, even though I probably wouldn't have supported him a few months earlier. On the other hand, I mean, he's going with the reddest meat he can find. I mean, there's the theory that this is going to be a foreign policy and defense election, and he's going long on that premise here, and I think we'll find out if he nudges that needle past 1.2.
All right, now we're going to take a look at the person who has the needle at 1.4. Carly Fiorina. She had an early look a few months ago. She's peaked, and now she's back down to 1.4%. Let's take a look at what she has to say.
You know, every election we hear a lot of talk, we hear a lot of good plans, we hear actually a lot of good intentions, but somehow, for decades, nothing really has changed.
Let me tell you specifically what my plan does.
A plan?
Under my plan?
His plan?
No, it's a two-phase plan.
And I have a better plan. And I want to talk about my plan some more. I hope we can.
My tax plan?
They put a plan out. They put out a plan, a bipartisan plan.
And they say it's the same plan.
Anybody can write a plan. How often do politicians put out detailed plans? How often do they get enacted? Never. That's the problem.
You talked about your tax plan.
All of our plans?
Every one of our plans.
All of my plans.
I actually have a plan. My tax plan.
Detailed plan.
Under my plan.
My plan.
The plan. 10% plan.
National Energy Plan.
Economic plan.
Mine is unique.
Concrete plan to do just that.
And there's a bunch of things my tax plan does.
Washington would love Trump's tax plan.
What we need now is a proven leader who has produced results. The truth is this, the big problem, we need a leader in Washington who understands how to get something done.
We need a leader in Washington who can get something done. Mitch Berg, is that Carly Fiorina?
There have been various times in this campaign where I certainly hoped so. I think that Carly Fiorina is, in some ways, sort of the flip side of the coin from Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is, in some ways, the nagging conscience, the nagging liberal conscience of the Democratic Party, with an emphasis on nagging. And I think Carly Fiorina, to some extent, is the same thing, with an emphasis on conscience. I mean, in some ways, she has been the one who spoke most clearly about, if not necessarily the plan, at least the conservative values that are supposed to be underneath the plan. I've been really impressed with what she says. Obviously, the how she says it has her back down to 1.4%, and maybe I don't know if that's a matter of lack of staff, lack of funding.
Why hasn't she resonated with the voters? I mean, they looked at her, but instead of being able to stay up at the higher levels, she came back down. I mean, what is it that she hasn't done?
Well, my 2 cents is what she hasn't done has spent her entire life in politics leading up to this moment here. I think what we're seeing with Carly Fiorina is the fact that she has building on basically a fairly, I won't say shallow base of support, but she's somewhat new to this. She has not been grooming herself for this for 6 to 8 to 12 years, like some of the other candidates have.
Or like Hillary Clinton since like 1973.
Yeah, basically, exactly. And I think you're seeing the fact that she doesn't have the funding, the organization in all of the states. She can't run as broad of a game as some of the other candidates. She's basically been a debate candidate so far, and that's a shame because I've liked what she's had to say pretty consistently myself.
Now we're going to take a look at Ohio Governor John Kasich. Now the interesting thing I'm noticing about Kasich is that according to Real Clear Politics, he is polling at 2% in Iowa. However, if you take a look at the next round, the next election that takes place in New Hampshire 8 days later, he's in third place at 12%. Mm-hmm. John Kasich from, 2 to 12%. What's going on there? And let's take a look at the ad and then get your take.
All right.
What happened to Jeb? He had the name, the money, the support, and yet a lukewarm message, weak debates, and sagging polls have left Jeb attacking John Kasich in desperation. John Kasich is a leader. He shrunk government, balanced budgets, and cut taxes $5 billion, and helped create over 400,000 jobs. America, there's a better, brighter way. John Kasich.
I'm John Kasich, and I approve this message.
So, John Kasich is polling so much better in New Hampshire than he is in Iowa. Why is that?
I'll just to throw in a little bit of my own perspective on this, and that is 6 months ago, if you'd have asked me, or 4 months ago even, if you'd have asked me who were my top 3 candidates, they were in order: Walker, Jindal, Kasich. And they were there for the same reasons. They were governors who had not only a good solid conservative ideology, but who had delivered on it under fire against a divided, in the legislature, that actually been able to convince the legislature to adopt their plans with generally excellent results. Of course, we know where Walker and Jindal ended up. So, but I think Kasich for someone who is a conservative who's looking for results and who has proven to have some executive ability to achieve things as an executive in politics. I think if you're a New Hampshire conservative and a pragmatist, you're going to be looking at John Kasich's record the same way I did 4 months ago and think, yeah, he's the guy packs the gear. Now, unfortunately, he's run a campaign that sounds, I think it was Mark Stein who said like he's running for America's mayor. And I think there's something to that. And I think this ad was just, I mean, who cares what George Bush said about you, John Kasich? You're running for president now. And if Jeb Bush is not a factor for you, he's certainly not a factor for us.
And then with John Kasich, his debate performances, especially the last 2 or 3 debates, has that hurt him?
I think so. I think it has. I mean, not so much in New Hampshire. They're sort of contrarian, and I think they tend to be more ideologically conservative than a lot of caucus voters out there, primary voters. My 2 cents worth, anyway. It's my opinion. I think he's come across like one of the. He reminded me of one of Jeff Dunham's puppets, the old fellow who's cranky about it. Walter. Thank you very much. My kids love him. I never really cared much, but yeah, he's between sounding like Walter or coming across like Walter the puppet, and again, I think Mark Stein was dead on. He sounds like he's trying to run for the job of America's mayor, and God bless him. He's done a fantastic job in Ohio, and we need a whole lot more governors like that on the bench. I just think he's probably run sort of a hectoring, scolding kind of campaign that hasn't sounded all that especially presidential for all of our loss, I think.
Now, when we put together this list of clips, we tried to go with the most recent one that the candidates and campaigns have put out. Unfortunately, for this next one, we actually have to go back to Christmas because they really haven't put anything out since Christmas that I'm aware of or that I was able to find. So we're going to take a look at 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, put out by Mike Huckabee.
Night before Christmas, and liberals were smiling. Free phones and health care. Santa Obama was conniving. With American jobs scarce, what better way to show care than to sprinkle good citizens with the hope of welfare? But Clinton's people were anxious and frigid, cold as ice, worried the Democrat playbook needed much, much more spice. Hillary's top henchman yelled at her high-priced attorney, "What will it take to stop this crazy old man named Bernie? Let's promise the incredible, new programs and big dreams. Put cost and worry aside, we're going to extremes. Free college, food, and housing, there's no room for criticism. We are Democrats, and we believe in socialism." So remember this Christmas when you gather round the tree, shiny Washington handouts are most certainly not free. And if by chance you whisper into the real Santa's ear, ask for one simple wish: get the liberals out of here.
So Mike Huckabee, who ran that ad at Christmas time, he was the winner of the Iowa caucuses in 2008 on the Republican side. And, that ad actually reminded me, in Washington, D.C. last week they had one incredible snowstorm, which for them is incredible, for us is just another average winter day. And a friend of mine in D.C. Called me up to tell me that she actually had seen a politician put their hands in their own pocket for a change. So that was last week's storm. But with Mike Huckabee, in all seriousness, he's sitting there at 2.2% right now in Iowa, state he won 8 years ago. Are the Iowa voters just saying, you know what, we gave you a chance, we're just moving on?
I think there's a significant chance he's going to turn into the Harold Stassen of the 21st century.
And Harold Stassen was who for the
former governor of Minnesota.
Millennials out there who are watching?
Harold Stassen, former governor of Minnesota, who I think ran for president in 1944, and then every 4 years thereafter until he couldn't anymore, which I think was probably the late 70s, maybe 1980. He was still taking a run at the Republican primary.
He was still talking about it in 92, I believe, and then he died not too long after that.
That's right. So, people are going, it's just a joke that keeps coming back, with all due respect to Harold Stassen. Mike Huckabee, I think, is putting basically doing a fairly rote performance at this point. I think he's equal parts trying to drive the race a little bit to the right in terms of social conservative voting, and also promote his various broadcast efforts here. And is he doing an adequate job of that? Well, he's got 2.2% of the vote, so it's certainly would suffice for his purposes. I think it's largely symbolic candidacy, and I think the fact that he doesn't have an ad out in Iowa since Christmas probably is evidence of that.
So what did you think of that ad and that message?
You know, I was an English major, and the liberties they took with the strict meter of a fairly standard rhyme was sort of like listening to fingers scratching on the chalkboard.
I kind of thought so.
Tighten it up, people.
Since I knew you were an English major and you have your bachelor's in English, I knew that would. I needed your opinion on that one.
Makes my teeth hurt.
So, looking at so far the undercards, how long do you think any of them are going to stick around?
I'm amazed that most of them are still here, and I frankly lost interest in the undercard once Bobby Jindal left the race, quite frankly. So I haven't watched undercard debate that I didn't have to for quite some time here right now. So I don't know. I mean, they could, as long as they have the time. I mean, none of them on the undercard right now are actually out campaigning. They're really not expending any resources, clearly some of them less than others, given Huckabee's advertising schedule here. So I think most of them are there symbolically and to try to drive something to the right and play, if not kingmaker, at least, I don't know, duke maker perhaps. So I don't know. Some of them could stick it out for a while here, and I just don't know that it matters much other than in terms of swinging a few delegates here and there around the margins.
All right, and we're going to take a look now at New Jersey Governor Chris Christie.
There's no one else who's running for president of the United States who's actually been responsible for prosecuting and investigating terrorists. Hillary Clinton will be nothing more than the third term of Barack Obama. She was one of the architects of this foreign policy. We need to send a clear and strong message to our adversaries that there are clear limits to your conduct, and that if you violate those limits, America's going to hold you to account. As president, that would be the top priority, to protect the lives of the people of the United States of America. I'm Chris Christie, and I approve this message.
Chris Christie sitting around 3 to 4% right now in Iowa, yet he seems to really, in the debates and on his messaging, he comes across presidential. What's going on with the Christie campaign?
I think, well, I don't know what's going on with the campaign. Frankly, I'm happy to see that he's still in the race. And I say that as someone who would probably not be considered a traditional Christie voter. I mean, he's a Northeast conservative, which means he's more comfortable with big government. He's mostly a national security type of candidate and a law and order type of candidate. Like a lot of Northeastern conservatives, he's much more comfortable with big government and government regulation than a lot of us Tea Party types are. And why he's still in it? Well, I think he's hoping that there's going to be a moderate surge at some point here, and basically trying to drive the race towards national security and law and order votes. I think Chris Christie is one of those people who's kind of maddening because I desperately want to like him. In so many ways I do. In fact, a lot of the ways that conservatives don't like him are ways that are irrelevant because, for example, he's weak on the Second Amendment. Everyone knows that, except the president has really relatively little to do with enforcing gun control laws around the country other than the bully pulpit, which is all Barack Obama has at this point, really. And so, frankly, if we could get somebody like a Chris Christie who's right on a lot of things that are important, national security, law and order, I could live with it, but I think he's basically in there to try and drive the race and hope for a surge that, you know, I think he was pulling up some decent votes in New Hampshire at one point.
New Hampshire, he's still sitting around 7.3. Some polls had him as high as 9.
Okay, yeah,
and
not
so
much of a surge.
He's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's in 6th place in New Hampshire and in.
Probably worse in Iowa.
7th in Iowa.
Okay.
So he's middle of the pack.
Okay.
Now, does the embrace of President Obama during Hurricane Sandy hurt Christie amongst the GOP base?
It does, and I think that's a shame, quite frankly. I mean, we have an awful lot of people on the Republican side. And I'm just going to jump up on a soapbox here real briefly.
Well, right ahead.
We have an awful lot of people who are obsessed with sort of brief symbols. I mean, chanting points, lines like hope and change, and even symbolic gestures like hugging the president when he was in town to bring federal relief after Hurricane Sandy. And it's like if you throw out every candidate who has one imperfection, who sins in some way against your orthodoxy, pretty soon you're left with nobody. I mean, Ronald Reagan signed some pretty obnoxious gun control laws when he was governor of California. He lived to regret them, but he signed them. And if everyone who was a single-issue voter in 1980 had eschewed Ronald Reagan because of the law he'd signed in 1968, which is a dumb law, and he admitted it later on, or a law he signed about abortion in 1968, that he was tricked into, basically, we'd never get Ronald Reagan. And this is, I don't know, I think this is a time for people to look and say, it's time to take a little more holistic view of our candidates and judge them a little more broadly than just a single issue that sets you on edge. And that's just, I'm to get off the soapbox now.
Well, the next ad is titled "Learn from Mistakes," and this is by Rand Paul. So let's take a look and let's find out, has Rand learned from mistakes?
Iraq, 2005. Hundreds of Americans have been killed in roadside bomb attacks, and 6 were killed in attacks linked to al-Qaeda terrorists Wad Ramadan Alwan and Mahanad Sharif Hamadi. A sniper and bomb maker, Alwan bragged he ate Americans for lunch and dinner. Kentucky, 2009. Alwan and Hamadi were welcomed into America by the federal government, given public housing and public assistance as refugees. Here, they attempted to send heavy arms to al-Qaeda and plotted an attack on an army captain in America. And yet, some refuse to learn from mistakes.
We have welcomed refugees, the tired, huddled masses for centuries. That's been the history of the United States. We should continue to do so.
Well, we've always been a country that's been willing to accept people who have been displaced, and I would be open to that.
But Rand Paul sounded the alarm.
It is almost a certainty ISIS will infiltrate. Why should we take one of these people?
Well, you know, this is one of the reasons I opposed Rubio's bill originally on immigration, because I didn't think there was enough scrutiny for those who might come and attack us.
Rand Paul wrote the amendment to suspend visas to nations with high risks of terrorism, but Marco Rubio voted no. Rand Paul is leading the fight to stop terrorism at our borders and protect Americans first.
Your thoughts about Rand Paul's ad and his 3.6% in the polls. I mean, even the undercard debate, he boycotted.
Right. And I think it's Rand Paul. First of all, I think it was a very effective ad for no other purpose than one thing. He's basically telling his father to go out to pasture and sit down and shut up for a while, and he's actually attempting to throw off, I think, the image that he's accreted through some of his, we could say, more thoughtful or more libertarian stances on foreign policy. I think this is an attempt to throw that off and allow for the fact this is, at least the conventional wisdom says, going to be a national security and defense and foreign policy race, and set himself out as somebody other than the sort of reputation I think he's sort of accreted over this race of being sort of the dovish hippie. I think it's an excellent spot as far as that goes, frankly.
He's got 3.6% in Iowa and only 4.2% in New Hampshire. Chances of getting enough delegates to really be a factor in this race at this point in time seems to be slim and almost none.
It seems slim and none. I saw.
Is he setting himself up for something longer term down the road?
I would have to think so, and part of me hopes so. I mean, obviously, if you remember my top 3 from earlier in the broadcast here today, I've favored governors, but among the crop of senators, Rand Paul has been the top of my list, at least initially. So far in this race, but I think, I forget who it was who said it. It wasn't Mark Stein. It was one of the major conservative pundits pointed out very correctly, I think, that Rand Paul has a high floor and a low ceiling. And part of that is just the fact that he is sort of the sole libertarian crusader in the race. Part of it is, I think he gets tainted with a little bit of his father's legacy.
In Minnesota, his father had a really good showing 4 years ago and even 8 years ago.
Okay.
Is that going to translate in Rand's favor here next month?
Well, I don't know, because, I mean, that's a great question, because so many of the Ron Paul people have turned up their nose at Rand and walked away in mute horror at the fact that he's playing so much toward the mainstream and committed some thought crimes against his father's legacy, which I think is frankly absurd. And I remember writing a piece in 2012 in which, on my blog, entitled "I Endorse Paul," which was an endorsement of Rand Paul and the fact that he was taking, I thought, the best so much of the best of his father's platform. And because bear in mind, I was a big L libertarian for a number of years back in the 1990s. I'm fundamentally sympathetic with libertarianism. I just don't think it largely works in the real world. And I think Rand Paul's pragmatism is both much needed in this race, much needed in this party, and absolute poison with his a good chunk of his father's base.
All right, let's take a look here at our next candidate du jour. That would be Jeb Bush, who's also polling at 3.6% in Iowa.
All right, with almost all of the vote now actually counted, we can now project that Hillary Clinton will win.
I'm watching Hillary Clinton receive the victory tonight.
They look at Donald Trump as the greatest gift from heaven, an easy person to beat in a general election.
And then she'll become the next president of the United States.
Thank you all. God bless you, and may God bless America.
Now, Jeb, having a brother and father who both served as president, having the big pockets, big dollar donors from, the Bush legacy, the Bush family ties, how come that hasn't translated into a better performance for Jeb?
Bush fatigue. I mean, I think that's the two-word answer.
That's what I've been saying for the last year.
Yeah, I think people, the punditry, up until last summer, late summer, early fall, underestimated the effect that Bush fatigue was going to have on people. I mean, George W. Bush was a very divisive president, and I think a lot of people, even a lot of Republicans, are thinking, man, I don't know if I want to have to carry that load for another 4 to 8 years. I mean, it was a difficult time to be a Republican when you were during the George W. Bush administration.
Even George H.W.
George H.W. He was a different character than his son, both of his sons, and it's a shame in a way because you look at the gubernatorial records of Jeb and W. And in a way, I almost wish we'd have had Jeb for president those 8 years. It might have turned out better, if fiscally, if nowhere else.
All right, take a look here at Ben Carson. America is safe in Ben Carson's hands.
Obama's America, a nation of broken fences and empty promises. Less safe, less hopeful. Politicians tried. They've failed. Dr. Ben Carson spent his entire career holding a child's life in his hands. Courage, inner strength, and belief in God allows him to look death in the eye and not blink. Thousands have trusted their children's lives to Ben Carson. We can trust him too.
I'm Ben Carson, and I approve this message.
All right, Dr. Ben Carson, he had peaked around 10 or 12%, and he's really dropped off, not quite to the extent that some of the others have. He is sitting at 7.2% in Iowa.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people love the Ben Carson story, including myself. I think a lot of people are looking at that story and thinking being a great surgeon doesn't necessarily qualify you to be a great president. People are starting to get serious about this, and much as we all love Ben Carson, I don't think we see a president in him.
All right, we're going to move on to Marco Rubio. We're going to do this real quick here because we're running out of time.
Hillary Clinton is disqualified from being Commander-in-Chief of the United States. Someone who cannot handle intelligence information appropriately cannot be Commander-in-Chief, and someone who lies to the families of those 4 victims in Benghazi can never be President of the United States. When I'm President, we are going to win this war on ISIS. The most powerful military in the world is going to destroy them, and if we capture any of them alive, they are getting a one-way ticket to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and we are going to find out everything they know.
I'm Marco Rubio, and I approve of this message.
All right, your take on Marco Rubio. He's in third place at about 12% in Iowa, and he is in fourth place. He actually just slipped to 10.7% in New Hampshire.
Yeah, I think it's significant that you didn't. It's one of the ads from the A-listers at this point where you didn't see any mention of any of the other candidates to speak of. He's running against Hillary Clinton already. He's banking on the idea, I think, that voters are going to start to get serious about November and start thinking who is the most presidential person in the field. I think that's what that ad says. Prematurely, we'll see. He's betting long, I think.
What are his strengths and weaknesses as a candidate right now?
Strengths and weaknesses, he presents his case very, very well, and he's probably one of the more gifted orators, in a field of excellent orators in many cases. I think his great weaknesses, he has committed some sins against conservative orthodoxy, and in a field where the conservative field is as fractured as it is, it doesn't take much to turn people off.
Would that be mainly immigration?
Immigration would be the big one, yep.
Okay. And let's take a look at Ted Cruz.
10 American sailors captured by Iran and humiliated on video. When our sailors were released, the White House said thank you to Iran. President Obama, how about our troops?
If I am elected president, no serviceman or servicewoman will be forced to be on their knees, and any nation that captures our fighting men and women will feel the full force and fury of the United States of America. I will have your back.
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
Now, before we get into discussing Ted Cruz, I do want to point out that Ted Cruz was in St. Paul back in December. North Star Oasis was there. We didn't cover it on our show, but we do have it on our YouTube channel. We actually have two versions of the event, and so go to youtube.com/North Star Oasis, and you can get Ted Cruz's visit to Minnesota with his complete unedited remarks. Now, turning to analysis, what do we have on Ted Cruz campaign and that ad? Another foreign policy ad, another A-lister. Your take?
I think Ted Cruz is an example of what I like to call in campaign terms, the Kaiser Soze school of campaigning. You win by letting the other side know that there's nothing you won't do. And I mean, he's banking on it being not only a foreign policy election, but a foreign policy election that will regard the biggest, baddest, toughest, hardest talking person who people perceive can deliver. I think that's what it's all about, and that certainly in that ad.
All right, and we're going to take a look at our final ad, and then we'll have a little bit of a wrap-up after we discuss this next candidate.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message. We are going to take our country, and we're going to fix it. We're going to make it great again. We are going to fix our health. We are going to take care of our vets. We are going to fix our military. We are going to strengthen our borders. We're going to build the wall, but we are going to strengthen our borders. We are going to make it great again. We're going to make it greater than ever before. Thank you.
Trump is leading with 33.6% in Iowa and with 32.3% in New Hampshire. Mitch Berg, your take on Donald Trump's candidacy so far?
My take is that Donald Trump is doing to the electorate exactly what Barack Obama did 8 years ago. He's telling a lot of people exactly what they want to hear. He's giving them a soundbite that resonates with people, sort of like Bernie Sanders' ad. I mean, that Bernie Sanders ad resonated with me, and I'm 180 degrees opposite from him. So, I mean, putting out images, statements, terms, images, both verbal and visual, that resonate with people who may not have put a whole lot of time and a lot of thought and a lot of effort, but certainly do get emotionally involved with the issue. That's what Donald Trump has been, for better or worse.
Kind of like what Jesse Ventura did when he got elected governor.
Bingo, that's exactly it. You tripped on something that a lot of us pundits have been in Minnesota have been trying to warn our friends around the country. We in Minnesota have been down this road before. You got someone who can talk a big game, and by the way, talking a big game is a lot of fun. I mean, when I'm president, there will be 3 walls across the entire length of the border. Mexico will pay us and tip us, and Vladimir Putin will bark like a dog. And I'll do this on my way to my 3rd date with Scarlett Johansson. There, I've just done everything Donald Trump has done.
Yes, you have. And with that, Scarlett Johansson, I'm sorry, you just got me there.
It's going to happen. and yeah, I mean, that's everything Donald Trump has done. And by the way, I take a certain amount of abuse from Trump fans for saying that. And I'm fine with that, because the best thing they can come up with, well, why don't you like Trump? I mean, give me some facts to chew on here, folks.
Does Trump have a pathway to victory, or is the lack of a ground game that I've heard so far in Iowa and New Hampshire going to hurt him?
You know, I used to wonder about the lack of ground game, and then I've been talking with some of his from friends who follow this thing, who says he's got a ground game on, especially South Carolina, which is his best early chance. And that is his people, unlike most Republican consultants, are keeping their mouths shut about everything. Amazing operational security, to put it in military terms. So he may have some surprises in terms of organization. We got that going for him here.
And Mitch Berg, AM 1280 The Patriot, and shotinthedark.info. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.